vocabulary of ladies and gentlemen. There was no such thing as the ladies' room. It was going to be the woman's room, because lady and gentleman marked a system of status functions they wanted to alter, and so on, with lots of examples. It's interesting to watch the changes in the vocabulary. Older American laws contain frequent use of the word spinster. Now that word is now obsolete in the United States, and I asked my class, how many of you are spinsters? This will not seem comical if you're not a native English speaker. One middle-aged woman courageously raised her arm. I thought she ought to get an A in the course, but none of my students would admit to being spinsters, because, well, that's an obsolete notion, but it is standardly used in American law. Okay, the point I'm making now, and this is the main message I want to get across to you, and that is, all of human institutional reality, and indeed, in that sense, all of human civilization, is created by repeated applications of a very simple form of linguistic representation, the status function declaration. You make somebody the boss by treating them as the boss. You needn't say, you're the boss, but you have to be able to say things like, well, we shouldn't really decide this issue till Sally gets here. That is, we treat Sally as the boss. We recognize her as the boss. Okay, but now that leads to the next question. Now here I've made a strong claim. All of human civilization created by this same apparatus. Why? What's the point? I mean, why don't we just everybody go their own way? And the answer is, this creates power. Status functions, without exception, create powers. Status function equals a certain kind of power, and to have a name, I'm going to call that deontic power. Status functions, without exception, create deontic powers, and those have names in English like rights, duties, obligations, permissions, authorizations, and authority of various forms. I call it, after the Greek word for duty, deontic, I call all of those deontic powers. Okay, so here's the set of equations so far. All of human institutional reality is created by status function declarations. The status functions so created are deontic powers. They're defined as systems of power relations. But it's a very peculiar kind of power, rights, duties, obligations, etc., because it's not, so far, physical power. What kind of power is it? To the extent that you recognize a status function, you recognize that you have a reason for action which is independent of your inclinations. See, when I go into the store and I give them one of these, they don't think, well, you know, should I accept it or not? It's independent of their inclinations. They're under an obligation to accept this and payment. Or to take another example, a guy asked me to give a lecture in Prague. On the day in question, I can't say, well, I don't know, who the hell, I don't know if I feel like giving a lecture today. I just assume just sit around Prague and drink beer. I recognize that I have an obligation. I have a deontic power, a negative one, and the deontic power then gives desire or inclination independent reasons for action. You get reasons for action that are independent of your other inclinations and desires. And now I want to make another strong claim. This is the glue that holds human civilization together. This is why you can count on people being accepting money in payment, accepting the commitments that they have made. In every case, institutional reality is a system of deontic powers, and those give reasons for action that are independent of the immediate inclinations of the person that recognizes the deontic power. Now that raises a complicated set of questions. How the hell do we create these things? How do we get away with it? And there's no simple answer to that. Often you create them, so to speak, out of thin air. My favorite example is this. In Philadelphia, which was a British Crown colony, there were no citizens there. They were all subjects of the British king. A group of men got together, and they were, as I said, all subjects in the British Crown colony, and they declared themselves to be independent. They even used my terminology. It's called the Declaration of Independence. They should have called it the Status Function Declaration of Independence, but they hadn't read my work on the subject. Okay, now how did they get away with that? Well, the shorter answer is they got people to accept it. Now, it took a long time before people accepted it, and indeed they had to fight a war. They had to organize another system of status functions, the Continental Army. And then the army had to go and fight the British Army. And it wasn't until we defeated Cornwallis at Yorktown that there actually was a United States that was recognized. By the way, something Americans like to forget, we couldn't have done it without help from the French. I mean, the French didn't do it out of charity, but they had other advantages that they wanted to get from that. But in any case, this is a case where a set of status functions was made effective, that is, it got collective acceptance by military success, by military victory. Again, the army is itself a system of status functions engaged in brute physical conflict with other systems of status functions. Now that was then imitated less than a century later by the Confederate States of America. They too thought, let's get together, as those guys did in Philadelphia, we'll do it in Richmond, we will create the Confederate States of America. It didn't work, but again, it didn't work because there was a huge struggle that resulted in military defeat. So I want to say, you have to look at the complexity of the situation. There isn't any general answer to the question, why do people accept systems of status function? Often they accept systems that are not in their interest, that are a part of a system whereby they are denied equal rights or an equal status with other people. Think of the treatment of women through most of European history. And yet women cheerfully accepted this because they thought this is how things are. This is the way it's supposed to be. And incidentally, it was not just they were oppressed by men. No, the women quite cheerfully accepted it. My mother became a doctor at a time when there were effectively no women doctors. She graduated from medical school in 1930. There was a good deal of discrimination against women doctors, much of it by other women. I can remember hearing my female relatives discussing whether or not they would ever go to a woman doctor, and men said, oh no, I could never go to a woman doctor. But so the feminists give us a false picture of the history if they make it look like men were oppressing women. Women adored the oppression. I've lived through part of that myself. I could lecture on that, but I'm not going to. Okay, so now we have the following system of equations. All of human institutional reality is created by a single type of speech act. That has the logical form of the status function declaration, where you make something the case by representing it as being the case. The point of those without exception is to create deontic powers, rights, duties, and obligations, and that includes both positive powers, like my right to travel as an American citizen, as well as negative powers like my obligation to pay my income tax. It includes all of the usual Boolean operations are performable on deonic powers, and the reason those work to hold human society together is that for people who accept them, if you accept the system of status functions, then you accept that you have reasons for action which are independent of your immediate inclinations. Okay, but now notice the result of all of this, and that is language is not like other social institutions. See, when I wrote speech acts, I thought, well, you could use such things as games to explain language. But now it's a consequence of this that you have to use language to explain games. The system of chess or European football presupposes language in a way that language does not presuppose games. Language is the fundamental human institution in a way that we can now state explicitly. See, most of us feel intuitively that's right, that if an anthropologist came back and said, well, in her tribe, They had a language, but they didn't have